had a chance to grab a cup of coffee and use the facilities. My name is Monica Patterson. I am a new hire here at Carleton at the Institute of Interdisciplinary Studies in Child Studies, and my own research is on South Africa. So I'm very pleased and privileged to be invited to serve as the chair for our next panel. We'll start with Linda Freeman, Professor of Political Science here at Carleton, who will be speaking on South Africa and Zimbabwe, Paradox and History.
Thank you. I was very struck by how the themes of the first panel melded into ours. Questions of no clear strategy rang bells. A kind of funny attachment to a shared past, the national question, which was in South Africa's past, tended to cloud, I think, the perspective from which they handled the future. Dan and I, in the early 2000s, started a project which never really came to fruition because we wanted to look at the way in which South Africa was reinventing itself as a regional superpower. Well, I would say that it's still very much a work in progress in that I don't think it's happened. At the moment of '94, I think South Africa went through a very morning after phenomenon. It had started out with enormous prestige, both for having slain the dragon, ended apartheid, but also having an iconic figure like Mandela at its head. And then the next morning, I think the rest of the region, and indeed the continent, woke up and said, God, here's this superpower with enormous military and economic might, as they believed at the time, which is a beginner. It's the new kid on the block. And very, very quickly, countries became nervous about the expansion of South African capital all over the continent, and nervous about just what this power would do in the political realm. This was particularly the case in South Africa's policy with Zimbabwe, where, as even Mandela said, Mugabe was the star and then the sun came up. And Mugabe was, of course, not very happy about being eclipsed. He'd been the central figure for the West and internationally in the region in the struggle against apartheid, and he has never taken politely to being put in the shadow. The paradox was that Mandela went through a very sharp learning curve, and South African foreign policy and diplomats went through a very sharp learning curve in the 1990s. There were three incidents which really marked this out. The first was a really catastrophic, in their view, handling of the Nigerian file. Mandela had been promised by the military dictator Sani Abacha that he would not hang the Ogoni Nine, Ken Saro-Wiwa and the others. And as Mandela was re-entering the Commonwealth, meeting at Auckland, a great moment, Abacha broke his word. Mandela was furious. He canvassed the world for sanctions and got absolutely nowhere. He got worse than nowhere. He got dumped on by his African colleagues. In fact, one Nigerian minister went so far as to dismiss Mandela as the African head of a white country, a puppet of the powerful white minority. The lesson for South African policymakers was very, very stark. They felt they'd been suckered by the West, who didn't back them when they opposed Abacha, and so they decided that henceforth they would never lead out in front like that, and so the reverberations for its policy on Zimbabwe was a very strong inclination to stay in step with broader African opinion. The second incident was the war in the DRC, when Laurent Kabila turned on Rwanda and Uganda. And this was playing into the growing trouble with Mugabe. Mugabe led or convinced Angola and Namibia to join him in supporting Kabila, and South Africa was trying to make peace. And the whole struggle became really quite petty in that South Africa would be left out of meetings and so on. The three went into the war. South Africa prudently stayed out. But it was another incentive to work with African opinion rather than against it. And the third case, of course, was South Africa's grotesque military intervention in Lesotho in 1998. where the South African military got its nose bloodied by a much tinier force determined to protect the national honor, and considerable damage was done to Lesotho cities and the economy. And that meant that when contemplating any kind of military action, as many people recommended in the early 2000s, when the Zimbabwe crisis started up, the military option was never taken seriously in South Africa. If they'd done this badly against Lesotho, how would they manage against Zimbabwe's much stronger army? So if you wonder why South Africa retreated, or the ANC government in South Africa retreated from its very strong record, people who had fought the good fight against apartheid, into supporting a government to the north whose policies and practices were becoming a byword for repression, brutality, and economic collapse, you have some precursor in what happened in the 1990s. And Mbeki, when he succeeded, Mandela came to power, leaving no doubt that he was not going to take the moral high ground, that he had a kind of realist, cold-eyed view of what he would do. And he became the central negotiator and regional facilitator as Zimbabwe went over the cliff in the 2000s. Thabo Mbeki left no one in doubt of his policy. He wished that there was a younger, more technocratic leader that could emerge to reform ZANU-PF, but failing that, he was willing to back Mugabe. Now, this policy had many contradictory elements because the Zimbabwean crisis did a great deal of harm to South Africa. Indeed, Nadine Gordimer said that it was one of the prime factors which prevented South Africa from transforming itself, with the influx of Zimbabweans to South Africa who wanted to survive and to be able to function. I mean, figures are very soft, but 2-3 million people left Zimbabwe as the crisis deepened, and South Africa got huge numbers of them, swelling its socioeconomic problems in the townships. It also damaged Mbeki's credibility with the West. His policy was, I think that phrase from Hein is brilliant. Mbeki had both an Nkrumah moment and a Blair moment. And when he was dealing with the West, he wasn't absolutely sure, I think, how he was going to play it, but he had both, primarily an Nkrumah moment, I think, in Africa, and then when dealing with the West, I think it was a Blair moment. For the 9 years in which he was the central negotiator and regional facilitator, Mugabe persisted with a policy of what became known as quiet diplomacy, in the teeth of biting criticism and meager results. The culmination of his efforts was the global political arrangement of September 2008. You only have to look at photographs of him to see how delighted he was with himself at having put it off. It was regarded as his greatest success. However, it produced an arrangement whereby the loser of elections in 2008 emerged as by far the stronger figure in the new political dispensation. I think what one can say, looking at this whole period, is that in the 20 years since independence, the South African regime has been unable to cope with the superior political negotiating skills of its northern neighbor. So it had two problems. One, its strategy was not clear. It faced all kinds of contradictory realities after the end of apartheid. But it also faced a northern neighbor who was one of the skilled, if not the most skilled, politicians in Africa. The regional superpower then was constantly outsmarted by its smaller northern neighbor. And this presentation is really going to argue that the sort of fatal flaw and the underlying problem was a shared commitment among the ANC cadre, whether it was in the Mbeki government or the Zuma government, to perspectives developed during the liberation struggle. Some of them were real, some of them were reinvented, some of them were quite different than the historical record. And I would say this is the central explanatory factor for the way in which history unfolded. It's funny, Mbeki, I think, believes that he is a Marxist. As Dan said, he was at one point very central in the South African Communist Party, and one would have expected a very materialist analysis and understanding of what was happening in Zimbabwe, instead of which I think it was profoundly idealist and deductive, in that he had this vision of the national democratic revolution. He and his team, and this is a view widely shared. I've talked to one of his key negotiators and his protege, Joel Netshitenzhe, Sidney Mufamadi, and they're all this way. And it's why I would argue that if you really want to understand why South Africa supported the Mugabe regime, you have to understand that sense of shared history in the liberation struggle. And Mbeki, for years, wrote a column in the ANC Today, and he kept talking about all for one and one for all. None has a possibility to succeed while another fails. It was really quite surreal, given that historically the ANC and ZANU-PF had not been on the best of terms. In fact, they loathed each other. But somehow there was this weird flip, and we had in Mbeki asserting, and his team asserting, that they would never do anything to harm the regime. And you would press them in discussions about, why wouldn't you take stronger action? Well, they went through silly moments where they said they couldn't, they didn't have the power. I think anybody who looked at what the apartheid regime did to Rhodesia when they virtually ended Ian Smith's project in Rhodesia knows that they certainly had the power. They had the power of fuel, electricity, financial support, you name it. But they weren't prepared to use it. I mean, I remember Joel Netshitenzhe just shaking his head and saying, no, we would never do that. And I think that was the kind of anchoring factor for this policy. And I think it rested on a series of propositions. I think there was a shared conviction in the ANC and of course ZANU-PF, that liberation movements had earned the right to rule. I mean, Mandela warned about this in a speech to COSATU in 1993. He asked, and this is perhaps the most important statement, how many times has the liberation movement worked together with workers and at the moment of victory betrayed the workers? He asked that question, and he said, you must support the ANC only so far as it delivers the goods. If the ANC does not deliver the goods, you must do to it what you have done to the apartheid regime. Can you imagine? In fact, Mugabe's views were quite the opposite. We're not going to give up our country for a mere X on a ballot, he told supporters. How can a ballpoint pen fight with a gun? And of course we have Jacob Zuma saying the ANC will rule forever and ever, at least until Jesus comes back. So that's point one. Point two, flowing from it as a corollary, is an intolerance of new political forces. And if you think of it, decades later, they're going to be young people emerging from the trade unions, emerging from civil society professions, whatever, who are going to have a political view, and it's not going to be identical to the liberation movements. And these liberation movements, without exception, have treated them as illegitimate, an affront, creatures of the West. They've recreated, and there are many kind of Alice in the Looking Glass moments here. This is one. They've recreated opponents because people who opposed them in the past were forces based in the Western capitalist world. Similarly, when these forces emerged in their countries, they were all Western puppets, so they were caricatured. A third related conviction to this was that liberation movements in power were revolutionary. Their policies were, by definition, progressive. If you interrogated their record in the three key areas which Hein was talking about, poverty, inequality, and unemployment, you became ipso facto counter-revolutionary. So that's another important conviction as part of this policy. And a fourth conviction was that former revolutionaries not only deserved to rule, but also to be rich. If you remember, Smuts and Gonyama's famous statement is that he didn't join the struggle to be poor. And so the wealth of Southern Africa was funneled to an elite. The justification, indeed the culture which emerged, was a sense of entitlement to riches, to legal impunity, to enjoying what previous rulers had no matter what. And I would argue that the policy on Zimbabwe flowed from these convictions. The key issue then became, in this view, that the West was unprepared to accept the radical reforms in Zimbabwe, which had transformed land ownership. And they also felt that concern about abuse of human, civil, and political rights were simply a smokescreen for, nefarious Western interests. Mbeki and other leaders had no illusions about the dire state into which Zimbabwe had fallen, but because they considered ZANU-PF to be the leading force and any other forces to be illegitimate, their goal was to rejuvenate ZANU-PF. That's the beginning and the end of it. Hence, during Mbeki's presidency, and I spent the summer reading very closely the record, you have this absolutely bizarre period of Mbeki scouring the world, going to Western governments for sources of finance for Zimbabwe once the land reforms began. At the outset of each initiative, Mugabe would promise that he would bring a halt to the invasions, withdraw invaders from the farm, tone down his rhetoric, and restore an orderly process. Mbeki then would set up meetings, arrangements, and financing, and all would come to a halt because Mugabe would immediately renege. And then instead of Mbeki saying something's happening here, he would then assure the world that rather than offending Mugabe, he would like to continue to find ways to offer him a way out. It was absolutely pathological process. The dance continued until all but a few hundred of the 4,500 white farms had been taken over. Zimbabwe's economy had all but collapsed, and Mbeki's reputation as a mediator was obviously not very good. As I said a minute ago, the corollary to this support of a very sort of deranged regime was a very hostile attitude to the movement for democratic change, which had emerged as the most significant opposition force in 1999 and has probably won every election since it has contested, maybe excepting the last one, but we don't really know. As far as the ANC was concerned, the MDC was an agent of foreign interests, a party of opportunists, demagogues, a pawn of white settler interest, donor financing, and hostile Western governments. I remember David and I sitting in a long, long morning with Cindy Mufamadi. We both, after the end of it, saying, we got that line and we said he never took into consideration the social forces which had produced the MDC in the 90s. There were real depths of discontent that were completely written off. The ANC just did not take the Zimbabwean opposition seriously. Instead, they kind of closed their eyes to the suffering of ordinary Zimbabweans, the human rights abuses, et cetera, and said, well, it wasn't good, but it was simply inevitable and expected in the final stages of the anti-colonial struggle. So everything was, in the long run, going to be all right. Now, this set of factors certainly do not exhaust the explanatory reasons for this policy. The other, of course, very important factor was the West's growing concern about what was going on in Zimbabwe and the region, and I would say this was Mbeki's Blair moment. He'd encouraged the West to believe that he was at the forefront of a new era in African relations with the West, and passing mention was made of his African Renaissance. There was also NEPAD, the quid pro quo for a massive transfer of resources from the global North was to be Africa's commitment to good governance. Well, clearly with people going through hell in Zimbabwe, the response to the Zimbabwean situation by South Africans was considered to be the absolute basic proof of African bona fides in the NEPAD deal. It only took 3 short years before, according to a NEPAD figure, wherever we go, Zimbabwe is thrown at us as the reason why NEPAD's a joke. But South Africa and other African countries at that point argued that not only would they not act on the issues raised in Zimbabwe, but they argued that this case should not be used to penalize the rest of the continent. And that was such a contradiction that one could hardly believe. Mbeki felt that the attention that the West and white South Africans paid to Zimbabwe was obsessive and racist, and he became angrier and angrier that the West would not support his approach. This continued right up to the 2013 elections, where Mbeki admitted that there were problems with them, but he was really furious that the West was critical. He said, the alternative voice in Washington, London, and Brussels, which says, no, you Africans are wrong, why this absolute contempt for the view of the Africans about themselves? Because as far as Mbeki is concerned, it's African voices should be primary, and this was all through the 9 years of his. So his tenure, during his tenure as president, he was quite erratic, because while he wasn't prepared to be the point man for the West, which George Bush had hoped, he wasn't prepared to burn his bridges either. And he was constantly falling between these two stools. And the contradiction became increasingly difficult to straddle. While he encouraged Western leaders to see him as the prime mover on things like NEPAD and the African Renaissance, he delivered very little to satisfy them. His reputation in the West became shock-worn, the excuses for his policy risible, and at the same time he became more and more irritated with the West. The other dimension of this paradox and contradiction was that Mbeki combined two things: an anti-imperialist perspective, which we can see in his support for ZANU-PF and his opposition to the MDC. But he also, as we saw this morning, wanted to make the South African economy attractive to international capital. And as the panel also pointed out, he was central to the ANC government's decision to adopt an aggressive neoliberal program in the 1990s. So how could he square that with these two contradictory impulses? And here one goes back to a very kind of crude, we used to call it paleo Marxism. In Mbeki's view, the long view resolved the issue. He believed that one could engage with global forces without being captured by them. And then one can read in an extraordinary letter that he sent to Mugabe, an attempt by Mbeki to tutor Mugabe in this perspective. He urged Mugabe and ZANU-PF to adopt the development path that South Africa had followed, partnering with capital, including white-owned capital. He told ZANU-PF that resort to anti-imperialist rhetoric would not solve the problems that Zimbabwe is facing. Zimbabwe was in no position to take on the IMF, or for that matter, the UK. So his advice for Mugabe, can you believe it, was to come to terms with these forces and use them for his own purposes. The focus should be development of the productive forces, and then later comes the revolution. The problem for Mbeki was that Mugabe did not share his perspective. He was lukewarm about the notion of an African Renaissance and positively cold on NEPAD. His view of the West and imperialism, therefore, preempted these possibilities. So, predictably, given these kinds of contradictions and the fact that the West didn't like Mbeki's policy, Mugabe didn't like Mbeki's policy, at the end of the 9 years, he was trapped in a quandary, I'd say bogged down. On the one hand, he was mortgaged by the lived experience of the past, to which he had a deep emotional attachment, yet searching for a renaissance of African power. Willing to be pragmatic, bending, but yet, and in that approach, bending to the desiderata of international capital, but not enough to abandon his loyalties. So he kept being trapped. He wanted to lead Africa and the region, but he had to negotiate the cross currents of great power status with delicacy. And finally, he wanted to be in touch with mass opinion in South Africa, which was more supportive of the Mugabe land reform than the Zimbabwean, if we believe polls, the Zimbabwean mass opinion, without setting off a radical land reform at home. In this quagmire of competing interests, it's not surprising that his efforts bogged down. Which brings me to the final ignominious chapter of Zuma, Zulu, and Zimbabwe. Thanks for that phrase to David. With the advent of Jacob Zuma, a stronger South African policy seemed finally to be at hand. didn't seem to be as patient with Mugabe, and he wasn't as dismissive of the MDC. More significantly, Zuma's power base was in COSATU and the SACP, both of whom had taken much stronger positions on the Zim crisis. In 2008, during ZANU-PF's bloody campaign, Zuma, on behalf of the ANC, said Zimbabwe's ruling party had deserted the values that came out of their nation's liberation struggles. Very strong statement. Even more important, he named a really tough negotiating team. I mean, Mac Maharaj, you would have thought, would have been very much up to the task. Lindiwe Zulu was the prime spokesman. But extraordinarily enough, nothing changed. Mugabe acted as he always had, and Zuma traveled the world trying to persuade everybody who had opposed them to lift sanctions. Zuma's facilitation team commuted to Harare back and forth without gaining any traction and sometimes being pitched out of the country. So although Zuma's own ascent to power in South Africa has been ascribed in part to his political street smarts, it's clear that he was out of his depth in Zimbabwe. Neither SADC nor South Africa fully appreciated the determination of ZANU-PF and Mugabe to recover from their electoral defeat in 2008, nor did they understand the political weaknesses and illusions of MDC leader Morgan Tsvangirai. As the drive towards regaining power through a new election grew in 2013, ZANU-PF pulled out all the stops, adopting not only a whole set of clever approaches within Zimbabwe, but also imaginatively nasty strategies towards the South African reform effort. They set impossible preconditions, like somehow the team and everybody else had to engineer the lifting of sanctions against Zimbabwe, or they wouldn't commit to any reforms. Then they began a volley of personal political attacks, first of all on Jacob Zuma, with Jonathan Moyo contending that Zuma's disconcerting behavior has become a huge liability, not only to South Africa, but to the rest of the continent. But the person who really came in for abuse was the lead of the facilitation team, Lindiwe Zulu. Mugabe called her a, quote, stupid, idiotic street woman. May I say that the persistent negative voice from South Africa, could it please be stopped? I appeal to President Zuma to stop this woman of theirs from speaking on Zimbabwe. When she suggested that there were difficulties in the elections running smoothly after a rather botched special vote, a furious editorial in the Herald asked Zuma to, quote, tether his terrier. Clearly, ZANU-PF did not like the way Zuma delegated South Africa's mediation to his team. Mbeki had more or less run the show, but Zuma's penchant is to delegate, and so it was the team, and particularly Lindiwe Zulu, who had really led the reform effort on the part of the SADC team. And Lindiwe Zulu took the reform effort that had been promised in the 2008 agreement seriously. She thought it meant what it said. But ZANU-PF hardliners absolutely detested her as a result. They had no intention of any reform. And when the team kept pressing, Mugabe threatened to pull out of SADC. Let it be known that we're in SADC voluntarily. If SADC decides to do stupid things, we can move out. Things came to a head when Mugabe and ZANU-PF pulled the plug in mid-June last year. He unilaterally set an election date for the end of July without reforms being put in place at all. This was the end of years of effort. Nothing happened. He was playing hardball, and I think Christopher Dell, the former U.S. ambassador, really summed it up when he observed that Mugabe is a brilliant tactician and has long thrived on his ability to abruptly change the rules of the game, radicalize the political dynamic, and force everyone else to react to his agenda. And this is what he did. At this moment, when the chips were down, did South Africa stand up to be counted? Instead, the government beat a hasty retreat. Even worse, they cut the ground out from under Lindiwe Zulu. A statement from the presidency announced that Zuma is the only one authorized by SADC to speak on Zimbabwe. Zuma reprimanded Zulu for jumping the gun in criticizing electoral preparations. I think Sisonke Mzimang has put it beautifully in her column when she said, Mugabe used that old sexist trope, control your woman, to put President Zuma in his place. Ambassador Zulu has been treated in a misogynist manner by an old patriarch, and the South African president has, unsurprisingly, not defended him. Neither did the ANC. In the end, Zuma and SADC were left in the dust, gulled into a reform process and a timetable which suited ZANU-PF, now confident of victory. And this next bit I owe to David Moore, who sent it to me. Reports have come out to suggest that after the election was called, Zuma and Zulu made it clear to MDC leader Morgan Tsvangirai that South Africa would back him if the MDC refused to participate in elections without reforms. They're also reported to have assembled 6 billion rand as compensation for the dispossessed farmers. However, the MDC was a weak reed on which to rest South African policy. Although Tsvangirai threatened a boycott, he reversed himself and decided to contest the election, and nobody with any brains within the MDC as well as within the South African initiative have forgiven him. At this point, Zuma and Zulu threw up their hands in despair and abandoned Tsvangirai. David Blair wrote a very eloquent column on this problem, and I'll just read a sentence or two, but it's too good to miss. Tsvangirai has torn his personal credibility to shreds. Everyone knows there's rarely a link between what he says and what he does. He's a man of many qualities, but he has failed as a politician. He should have the wisdom to admit as much and to leave the scene with honor. At this point, Zuma and other SADC leaders threw in the towel. Elections proceeded on the 31st of July last year without any of the GBA reforms in place. Mugabe's determination to ride roughshod over the reform effort had prevailed. SADC stayed silent, Zuma and his government abandoned ship, and Lindiwe Zulu was hung out to dry. As we know, ZANU-PF emerged triumphant from the July 2013 election. The rout was complete when Zuma was one of the first to congratulate Mugabe on his victory and to urge the MDC to accept the outcome. Mugabe chose the SADC summit in Malawi in mid-August to apologize to Lindiwe Zulu for his remarks. A day later, Zuma officially concluded his facilitation role, apparently drawing a line under the election and 5 more years of ZANU-PF rule. Mbeki appeared at the inauguration with wall-to-wall teeth. Very great cheer that once again the party of the National Democratic Revolution had come to power. No one could be left in doubt that Mugabe had not only won the election in Zimbabwe, but also put paid to attempts in the region to promote reform. He'd successfully called everyone's bluff. The hated government of national unity was in the past, and ZANU-PF resumed control. That said, the victory, as we know, in the succeeding year has been Pyrrhic. Zimbabwe's economy has returned to the nadir of pre-coalition days, as investors wouldn't touch it with a barge pole. Both ZANU and PF, more significantly, and the MDC have fragmented. Most recently, an angry Grace Mugabe, Robert Mugabe's young wife, has toured the country in a bid to demolish Vice President Maduro, and despite her lack of presidential experience, to put herself forward as a presidential candidate. To resurrect a very overworked quotation, with apologies to you, John, from Gramsci's prison notebooks, the crisis consists precisely in the fact that the old is dying and the new cannot be born. In this interregnum, a great variety of morbid symptoms appear, indeed. With the South African economy also in trouble, and Zuma's own credibility and reputation at a low, and catalyst to sitting atop a mountain of other scandals, ratings dropping, and so on, the prospects for further reform initiatives in the region, I think, are bleaker than at any time since 2000. Instead, we have the macabre spectacle of Mugabe taking all before him and is set to bask in the limelight. Since mid-August, he has been unanimously elected to occupy the rotating chair of SADC, and is also in pole position to become chair of the AU next year. So far, then, I think it's safe to say and to conclude that the case of South Africa's relations with Zimbabwe in the new millennium have turned on its head the usual expectation of outcomes in a struggle between a large and a smaller power. As Sumaiko Tinu has observed, quote, intransigence, rudeness, blackmailing, and bullying were all part of Mugabe and his party's well-crafted diplomatic strategy, which they used to effectively outmaneuver their South African counterparts. For all his country's military might and economic prowess, South African policy could not match Mugabe's bulldozing diplomatic strategy. So I think that we can see South African policy failures as a product of a weird, twisted attachment to an invested past worthy of Lewis Carroll. Thank you.
Thank you, Linda. Our next panelist is Richard Saunders, an associate professor of political science at York University. And he will be presenting a talk called Extracting Value from Crisis, Bargains, Benefits, and South African Investment in Zimbabwe's Material Sector.
Thanks. It's good to be here, and thanks for the three presenters for providing such engaging, thought-provoking material. And I'm particularly happy because as soon as I submitted my title for this talk, focused on the mining sector in Zimbabwe, given past work I've done on the wider spectrum of South African investment in the region, I thought, I've made it too narrow. My colleagues who've spoken before me have actually helped to open up a space which I'd like to play into. So I'd like to, in this talk, not just talk about extracting value in the Zimbabwe mining sector in this period of crisis, especially the 2000s, but look at the broader sweep of South African investments in the post-apartheid period into the region. In fact, I think there's a lot of overlap between them, obviously. And in some ways, the Zimbabwean mining sector is an extreme case, which points the finger at some of the increasingly prominent aspects of South African investment in the region. And that involves political linkages, not just economic linkages, and political guarantees in a very risky investment climate. So, let me just say that the material I'm drawing on is from three different periods, three different surveys, which I've been involved in, which were very much in each their own way of their time. So the first was a SADC investor survey undertaken by BusinessMap, the unit set by Jenny Cargill, former ANC cadre, in 1996-97. And BusinessMap did a lot of consulting around black economic empowerment and ways for white business to find a way forward, but also ways for black entrepreneurs to find a way into policy making, into the space of investment in South Africa. By 1997, BusinessMap had been inundated with requests, research requests from larger corporates, but also smaller South African companies, medium-sized companies, to find out about the region. They knew so little about the region, given the fact that apartheid had broken historic linkages with them. There was some trading through Botswana and other various means, but not a lot of direct investment because of boycotts against South Africa. And business saw an opportunity. If you want, there was kind of a perfect storm at this time. The neoliberalization or the structural adjustment programs in the region had softened those markets, opened the way to privatization, to lower controls on capital flows, foreign direct investment, even raising money in local markets by foreigners for local investment. So the way had been opened. So BusinessMap, with its SADC investor survey, did a 2-year study by looking at all South African investments over 1 million rand into the region, over 10 million rand in public sector investment, which also became important, into infrastructure from the Development Bank of South Africa, from loans mediated by international financial institutions and other means. So this is a very wide survey, and it was different from other kinds of statistical surveys by the fact that we went and actually interviewed those companies, both in Johannesburg or wherever they were in South Africa, and in place in 12 African countries, and followed those investments over a 2-year period. If you want, it was that survey was looking at volumes, but also logics of capital, and why certain risks, big risks, were being taken in an accelerating way into the region. That's the first survey first bit of data I'd like to draw on. The second was from the mid part of this past decade, of the first decade of the 2000s. And that was Cadesria funded research looking at a project with South African, Zambian, Mozambican, and Tanzanian colleagues, looking at South Africa in Africa, policy making around investment and trade, but particularly from the point of view of the region, not from the point of view of sources of capital in South Africa, but from the point of view of the satellite, if you want, versus the metropole. And from there, the experience of South African investment looked very different. Some of the language of sub-imperialism and the steamroller of South African corporates into the region looked more like a problematic take, because what we increasingly found, and I hope to have time to explore this a bit, was pushback from the region. That we developed this notion that if capital is a social relation, well, so is investment. Capital is an antagonistic social relation with a lot of human agency and strategic capacities to push back, and so is investment. We see this in Zambia, in Tanzania, and Mozambique. We see it through a rolling back of a number of privatizations. And I would say in the case of Zimbabwe, we see it in pushback on Mbeki and business buddies in mining. The third bit of data I'm drawing on is on mining currently in Zimbabwe, and particularly around the issue of conflict diamonds, something I've been working on since 2006. Hopefully we can come back next year to launch our book here on edit a collection on the political economy of power, security, and blood diamonds in Zimbabwe. And that material really looks more directly at a feature which seems to be more prominent in recent years, and that is the political content of cross-border investments from South Africa north. As competition from the Chinese, Brazilians, and Indians has heated up, South African corporates, South African black economic entrepreneurs have increasingly used the muscle of ANC political elite and the ANC government to leverage their way into increasingly difficult investment and competitive investment markets. So I'd like to start the talk by looking at this broad sweep of investment. How do we understand it? What's happened? What questions it raises for around the loyalty of the South Africans to Robert Mugabe, which I think includes economic loyalty, as we'll see in the mining sector, and economic buy-in. And I'd like to extend it to then look at the more extreme case of Zimbabwe, the world's, of course, fastest collapsing peacetime economy in the 2000s, with most of its productive mines in mothballs, still becomes one of the #1 destinations for South African entrepreneurs in sub-Saharan Africa over a very short period of time. How do we make sense of that? And I think it relates to the broader issue of leveraging profit from crisis using political capital and not just technical and financial capital. So let me begin with South African foreign direct investment in SADC, or the lesson of extracting value from market gaps and social crises. There's a lot of literature on this, of course. Roger Southall, John Daniels, Henny Melber, various pieces by the South African Institute for African Affairs, all agree on that there has been a rising tide up until around 2005, 2006 of South African investment. I'm not going to talk about trade, which is another issue, also a rising and explosive growth in cross-border trade into the region, which by 2002 was benefiting South Africa by a factor of 9 to 1, by 2004 a factor of 12 to 1, and it's probably diminished right now in the context of the Chinese. But the reason I want to look at financial investment is because it tends to indicate more of a long-term engagement, it's more structural, it's displacing in its effects, and it has a way of pulling in political elites as part of the economic bargain of investing. And if we look at very briefly at the rise since 1994 of FDI, there's some, if you want, some signature features. One I've already mentioned, the neoliberal softening up of the region through privatization, but also through a wide-ranging change of legal codes around mining laws, for example, around local domestic financing of foreign investors, something that Hein referred to, but also happened in the region, complete liberalization of capital flows and exchange rates in places like Zambia. And a big one, which became very important for the South Africans, which is guarantees of repatriation of profits, which became a very big point of attraction for small, large, and medium-scale South African investors. Not to forget labor code changes and the widespread, if you want, not introduction, but extension of EPZs, which South African companies also took advantage of, particularly in places like Mozambique and Namibia. So, to begin with, there was, as part of this perfect storm creating a wave of South African investment, there was a softening up of the region. And on the other hand, we have a number of market, if you want, market-driven pull-push factors, and these, some of which we've heard from South Africa already, a real crisis of overaccumulation already within a few years. The uncertainty around the stability of the rand and what that meant for the export of capital, as both Hein and Dan have mentioned, a push to export. You know, a lot of the focus of the literature on South Africa is the push by the large corporates, Old Mutual, Digidata, SAB, but we also see the same thing happening with smaller, even entrepreneurial capital inside South Africa. And much of the wave, not in terms of the dollar value, but in terms of the number of investments across the border, are actually small and medium scale South African companies, which are under real duress because of rising competition, bringing down of tariff barriers, foreign dumping, but also overaccumulation in the local market. SADC, for an overaccumulated South African market, represented real opportunity. Crisis and risk, an opportunity to use domestic products to initially and then later perhaps set up assembly or or production, to use domestic production and domestic stocks of capital to leverage their way into a risky market, but a market which in many ways resembled the large market of poor black South Africans. Lusaka and the consumer market in Lusaka looks very much like many of the consumer markets in Witwatersrand and in the Western Cape. And companies told us this from the very beginning. We understand what this market is about. We know how to do the leveraging. Higher purchase works for us here. We know what the margins are. We need to do a few test case studies. We'll go to Lusaka. Lusaka became the equivalent of, Burbank used to be for Hollywood or television. Lusaka became the test case. And so we see the first place in Southern Africa where there's lots of malls, a lot of the South African chain stores coming in, the South African banks, Standard Bank comes in, and of course, large-scale too, mining investment into the copper belt through privatizations. South Africa had some of the larger medium-scale companies and some of the, like ShopRite, Checkers, Game, and Profern, and larger miners coming in with the help of the banks. One of the real appeals for the medium-level investment, which becomes, if you've traveled across Southern Africa, you've seen these South African stores everywhere, and from the food franchises Nando's to Profern and Barlow, which are furniture companies, and Whitegoods, which met market need in Southern Africa, outside of South Africa, that had not been met for a long time outside of Zimbabwe. One of the real points of appeal for all these companies, and they told us again and again, was the capacity that Southern Africa and its poor markets gave them to dollarize rand production. So if you're a small, low-end producer of white goods, fridges and stoves, cookers mostly, and things used in townships, you could take second-rate product, which is not selling so well in South Africa, is deeply discounted, move it into the region, open up markets using higher purchase, and extract enormous value. So we see Profern and Barlow moving into places with a very small number of salaried people, but with low salaries, but using access to the state and financial regulations to extract paychecks from schools, public sector, and what have you, and leveraged their way in for white goods. Malawi became one of the most profitable investments for Profern in southern Africa. The same thing happens in Zambia and eventually in the DRC, all the way up to Tanzania and Uganda and Kenya. Dump your product, you revalorize it, and you can repatriate your profit produced for rand in US dollars from Zambia, Malawi, and elsewhere. Moreover, you don't need to bring the money back to South Africa. You can use it to generate a hothouse of investment across Africa, and in the case of Nando's, all the way to Canada, the UK, Australia, and elsewhere. ShopRite's done the same thing. You add all this together, there's one more strong enabling factor I should touch on, the role of the South African state. Hein touched on this earlier, 30 times the capital export limitations were changed, beginning in 1997. So it made it much easier for South African corporations not to move anywhere in the world, but there were specific bonuses for moving into Africa and even bigger bonuses for moving into SADC countries. By 2004, South African firms could invest up to 2 billion rand, which was about 330 million US dollars per project in Africa. In 1997, it was only 50 million rand. There's an explosive growth and expansion mediated by the DTI. And for anyone who was looking at business news at that time in Southern Africa, there were hand-in-hand delegations of DTI, of South African Reserve Bank, along with South African capital. The African Renaissance may have had a very articulate spokesperson in Mbeki, but the face of the African Renaissance in the region was white capital. That's very, very clear. What does all this result in? Well, it's a kind of large rising tide of FDI into SADC from South Africa that we saw after 1994. Between 1994 and 2004, South Africa provided 22% of SADC's FDI overall, and that's quite incredible given the rising role of China in the region at that time. South Africa was the #1 source in 7 countries in 2004 of FDI, and in some countries made up 40% or 45% of the total FDI on an annual basis. This is a large amount of capital. By 2005, and I guess what I'm getting at here is the diversity of this experience that once it took off. By 2005, 34 of the 34 top JSE companies were invested in 27 African countries, 232 investments, and employing more than 70,000 Africans, therefore engaging local states as well with a stake in South African investment in terms of revenue, employment, benefits, skills, training, what have you. We saw a lot of multiple country investments once people realized that the risk wasn't as great as it could have been and the profits were very high. ShopRite, MTN, Stanbic, Profern, Nando's, the list goes on and on. And it's driven by the fact that by 2004, South African companies' rate of profit in Africa is much higher than it is in South Africa, in some cases 3 to 5 times as much on an annual basis. And not only that, it's not stuck in that measly little rand, it's in US dollars, and you can do what you want with that profit once you make it. In, let's remember, low tax threshold economies because of structural adjustment. So we see as well quite a big reinvestment. UNCTAD in 2005 said that 57% of South African FDI in Africa was actually being reinvested in other neighboring African countries. So there is some kind of hothouse effect that's taking place, at least up until 2008. The figures are less clear and widespread after that, but it appears to have been disrupted, one, obviously by the financial crisis, but two, by a rising tide of Indian and Chinese investment, which is competing, which has as much political muscle and probably more political credibility given the crisis of neoliberalism as a developmental model after 2008. Some of the largest investments, of course, we know about, famous ones, Mozal, an aluminum smelter, which the Japanese and South Africans are involved. It's a typical model in Mozal in Mozambique, where the bank accounts and the currency of work are actually US dollars, not South African rand or Mozambican Medical. and the bank accounts are in Mauritius, the big offshore banking center. We see the same kinds of things going on in Namibia, Scorpion Mines, and even in Zimbabwe with Zimplat's 200 million plus investment by Implats, South Africa's big platinum miner, in 2001 and 2004, at precisely the time when Zimbabwe mining is in trouble. But I just want to underline the fact that we also see a big diversity. So in the retail sector, we wouldn't normally see companies going across borders. We see, because of softening up by South African trade, we see companies moving in and actually buying up and displacing local capital. Nowhere do we see this more than in Zimbabwe, where there's been a process of deindustrialization, and we see former factories turning into warehouses for South African products like Ceres fruit juice. Never touch it. So Ceres is cheaper in Canada now than it is in Zimbabwe because of price gouging, because they own the market. We also see MTN, the biggest cell provider in Africa. Africa's its most profitable market. ShopRite, Checkers, 17 countries, and so on and so forth. But we also see South African state itself investing. Eskom, Spornet, Rhodes, South Africa, investing in other parts of the continent. Carmody, in that his really provocative article from way back when, in the early years of this, talks about South Africa's inward, outward initial approach to globalization. He really talks about mutual and digidata. I think the situation on the ground is actually much wider and richer and more troubling in terms of the scale of capital that's involved. But there's one thing also I think it raises, and that is the vulnerability of South African capital of a smaller scale in each of these countries. Once countries, in a period of multi-party democracy, Zambia is a good example, once countries begin to get pushback from below and complaints about the displacement of jobs, about having to buy South African milk and tomatoes and lettuce rather than Zambian milk and lettuce and bread and what have you, and where they begin to extract concessions from the state in attempts to discipline capital. Disciplining capital might sound like a pie-in-the-sky issue, but when it comes to a mine, you can't pick it up and take it away. When it comes to a dairy, which you've invested in a lot of high-tech investment by Profer in South Africa, in Zambia, you don't easily pick it up and take it away. It has knock-on consequences. And states and countries in the regions, I would argue, as part of what we found with the Kadesri work, have become more and more adept at recognizing the soft underbelly and not expropriating capital, but learning how to extract concessions from them. And capital at the same time from South Africa has learned the benefits of becoming embedded and national, which is a phenomenon that's not unique to South Africa in the region. Zimbabwe's mining represents a particular case, and one I think which reflects the intensely politicized and elite-driven nature of new investments that we've seen in recent years. And in many ways, Zimbabwe's mining investments is a real paradox. I mean, Zimbabwe in the 1990s, under neoliberal reforms, land reforms around mining codes, and lifting of constraints on capital flows, Zimbabwe's mining underwent a real renaissance. It was a boom country in the 1990s, and ironically, it was a time when established South African players left because other players, Canadians, Australians, and others, were coming in with more technology, more competitive, and wanted to play the big game. South Africans, and including some Americans, Union Carbide, Anglo America, made plans to leave in the 1990s at a time when expansion of exploration and new plant was coming online. In the 1990s, ESAP created the conditions, neoliberalism created the conditions for mining expansion. The problem for those who invested was that ESAP also created the political and social crisis conditions for the collapse of the Zimbabwean economy in the 2000s. We don't need to belabor the fact that there was a social crisis, complaints about loss of social services, a militarization of politics after 1997 and the intervention of the war vets, and all of this leading to what we see beginning of the crash in 1980, 1998, 99, into the 2000s, and a donor boycott after Zimbabwe's intervention in the DRC in 1998. All of these moves, to give you a very thumbnail sketch, all of these moves have very direct and negative, catastrophic impacts on the successful Zimbabwean sector, which had been top 3 gold producer in Africa and top 10 in the world by 1998. By 2001, 14 of the new gold mines opened in Zimbabwe were shut. Such was the catastrophic fall because of the lack of foreign exchange to fuel petrol imports and electricity, because of the collapsed secondary industry, the threatened invasion of some mines by war veterans, and so on and so forth. We see a real mothballing of an entire industry. Other parts of the sector which were very appealing for investors, like platinum, were put on hold. In the early 2000s, as commercial agriculture was declining, as foreign exchange earnings were plummeting, as Zimbabwe was under a donor threat, there was a real need by the government for forex, foreign exchange, to pay for fuel imports. If anybody was there at the time, you remember the long queues for cars, for petrol. They needed investment capital to run and to buy replacement parts and fuel inputs for that production which still existed, and it needed some way of getting all of these inputs and investments without running afoul of U.S. sanctions, which made it effectively illegal to do business, financial or otherwise, with ZANU or any Zimbabwean state firm under threat of penalty to you. All of this created, a dire need of political protection for new investment and a hard need for cash. And there stood South Africa. In a period of extreme crisis, the South Africans had what Zimbabwe needed, both South African black entrepreneurs and the ANC. It had capital, technical, fluid, liquid capital that it could access either from London or from Johannesburg. It had cross-border economies of scale. Zimbabwe's platinum is not smelted in Zimbabwe. It's smelted in Iran. And it had probably the most valuable asset, investment protection guarantees, which came with Thabo Mbeki, the ANC, and the leveraging of their mates into Zimbabwe's mining sector. So the result we see was a very sharp wave of South African foreign direct investment into Zimbabwe from around 2001. 6 of the 7 new big mining investments in the 2000-2005 period, this time when Zimbabwe was in free fall, are South African mining companies, and 5 of those are small-scale mining companies, and we recognize their names: Nzikhumalo, Richard Hadebe, Patrice Motsepe, and others. Medalon is a good example of Nzikhumalo, who'd never been in Zimbabwe before for any mining business. Medalon leverages its way in and buys, in one fell swoop, 51% of the installed gold mining capacity in Zimbabwe, and is never touched, ever, under indigenization rules or by the war veterans or anybody else associated with the government when everybody else is being touched. The bigger investment, well, there's another investment too, which is an interesting one. Moana Africa, which is a reverse takeover of Clough Gold. Moana Africa has on its board of directors people from the DRC, ZANU-PF, and ANC-related people in South Africa, formerly at Anglo-American. They don't raise money for and to unlock investments in Zimbabwe, which have been shut down to foreign investors for a long time, all of a sudden open up. They don't raise their money in South Africa, they raise their money in London minerals markets. So the liberation movements and political class of the DRC combined begin to raise money for investments in Zimbabwe via London finance markets. Very, very creative. And of course, the final big investment, a world-beating investment, is by Implats in Zimbabwe Platinum Mines, one of the world's most profitable on a per-ton basis platinum mines. And 20% is, as part of the buy-in, is given to silent shareholders that can be nominated by government. Increasingly, that gets ratcheted up as the unpublished secret Black Economic Empowerment deal, which unlocked Zimplats for Implats, never talked about, never shown to anybody, that gets protected in the face of all the inroads by indigenization in Zimbabwe. Zimplats gets protected. The details of that deal I can talk about at another time, but it's astounding how they get away with transferring corporate social responsibility money into black economic empowerment credits and buy themselves an unlimited future in the most valuable platinum mine outside of South Africa. Of course, the worst and most egregious case, which is also, I think, very worrying, is the more recent case, which I'm working on now, of Marangwe diamonds, Zimbabwe's blood diamonds, which are artisanal diamonds discovered in 2006, in which the setting up and the normalization of mining has involved security interests of the security forces in Zimbabwe, depending on who you listen to in the ZANU debates, Grace Mugabe or Joyce Mujuru, and South African-based management companies which previously had no experience in managing diamond mining or mining of any kind. And bear in mind that this is the world's largest diamond strike in the last 20 years and is now supplying 25% of rough diamonds into the world market. And the naming of the mining companies or the selection of them to take over the mining was actually done against even the advice of ZANU's own Zimbabwe Mining Development Corporation, which said, we don't know these people, and the minister said, sign the contracts with a South African connection, a ZANU connection, and a security connection. That's part of the Marangwe story. It's a long story. It's a very troubling one. The other part of the story is the more overt political support and strategic support given to Zimbabwe in the context of the Kimberley Process certification scheme. You might remember the Kimberley Process had effectively put a ban on the export of Zimbabwe Marangwe diamonds from 2008 up until 2011-12. Very instrumental in all of these meetings of Kimberley Process and in supervising research into what was going on the ground was the role of the South Africans. Of course, the main point man who was put in place to inspect and deliver technical reports advising yay or nay on the cleanliness of Zimbabwe diamonds was Frank Chikani's brother, Abbey Chikani, who played the most disgraceful role imaginable, which everybody knows about, but was kept in place, protected by the South Africans. If you want any evidence that the ANC and the South African government have been involved in undermining the transparency of resource extraction, the redistribution and better beneficiation, if you want, from high-value minerals, there's no better example than the performance of the South Africans in the KP from 2008 on, and particularly during 2013 when South Africa was the chair of the whole KP and subverted and deflected any of the initiatives from below to try to reimpose sanctions on Zimbabwe. If I was to wrap up on Marangwe and try to draw some sense from it and what we make of it, I think we need to say that, in the context of South African corporate and elite involvement, both in the broader mineral sector in Zimbabwe, but particularly in the case of the criminalization of production of diamonds in Marangwe, that it's very difficult to see how South African participation has not stood in the way of the kind of meaningful developmental reform that one would have expected to see, and many people in Zimbabwe, including many parts of the industry, hope to see, including the Chamber of Mines, which has been very much against this kind of criminalization of mining. Zimbabwe has officially signed on to the African Mining Vision, and so is South Africa. It's a laudable vision in some ways of investing in beneficiation and training up locals to become involved in the industry and so on and so forth. But everything about Marangwe and everything about what we've seen with the bigger investments in the 2000s flies in the face of any potential for beneficiation. There's big resistance, for example, by the South Africans, backed by the South African government, to move smelting and processing of platinum, the biggest export, back into Zimbabwe and to create jobs and technical capacity. Likewise with diamond processing, polishing, if not cutting. It's also very hard to see, given the particular role of the South African companies in the state in allowing and looking the other way at cross-border smuggling, and South Africa, not Mozambique, is probably the #1 tracking point for Zimbabwean diamonds into the black markets of the world. And in forcing Zimbabwe to, or leveraging Zimbabwe to look the other way on BEE deals, and to put in place community share ownership trusts into which no money has been put in. The South Africans have been very insistent, and the companies have been very extortionate in demanding that despite all the paper protection and paper sovereignty around minerals and redistribution, they've been quite effective in denying that these paper rules are not put in practice. And there's no better example of that than Orange Diamonds. In these ways, I guess, it's a long story, but I've just given you thumbnail sketches of it in the case of the diamonds. And in these ways, I think you can make a very strong case that the developmental potential of the mining sector, which is really the only economic sector left in Zimbabwe, has been deeply, deeply damaged by South Africa's political and economic entanglement. Overall conclusion, if I'm return to the broader spectrum of investment, one thing and I will be ending, I don't have much time to talk about, but which I would point you to if you're interested, is the very strategic and innovative ways in which sectors and producers in the region have pushed back. Bridget Kenny has done a really interesting study of how peasant dairy producers, milk producers, fresh milk producers, and cheese producers have pushed back against Parmalat and have roped Parmalat into their orbit by locking in supplies of fresh milk into Parmalat rather than Parmalat using international supplies of milk and butter. But we also see in Tanzania the rolling back of the privatizations of the airline, of the port, of the water and electricity grid in Dar es Salaam, all because of effective political pressure from below. In Mozambique, we see more middle-class kind of pressure and demands for better positions in the management executives and so forth of companies like ShopRite, and higher quotas for local sourcing of goods being put in places like Zambia and Mozambique. I think that opens up a really interesting strategic place. Think about what is it that they've done in Zambia with what combination of social forces, what's worked to push back and to get at the soft underbelly of the South Africans, and in fact to get buy-in from South African companies like Profern, for example now, which markets itself in Malawi as a Malawian company, no longer as South African, and which has been better about using local managers. How do we make that happen? We're not going to overthrow capital, but maybe we can discipline it and use increased revenues from capital to redistribute and start to think about linking and embedding in a more regional-centric way South African capital in the way in which it engages.
So we have some time for questions. And maybe we'll go with the established pattern of taking 3 at a time. And if you could introduce yourself, that would be great.
My name is Laurent Charette. I was the head of Canadian mission in Mozambique between 2001 and 2004. And you will not be surprised that at that time I was almost every month called by the embassy, not the Embassy, Foreign Affairs of Canada, to make representation of the Mozambican government to help put pressure on Zimbabwe. And I remember the frustration of the Mozambican political class, I guess, from President Chissano to many ministers. But one anecdote I think is giving for myself, the frustration that I would say many people had, and they didn't really have any possibilities to change it. Once I was with the Minister of Foreign Affairs asking from Canada to make pressures on Zimbabwe. He looked at me and said, I'm going there tomorrow. Do you want me to have a gun and shoot him? What do you want me to do? Who have done anything possible publicly and privately. And I think that was really the frustration of many of the political class. I've seen one of the deputy ministers in Mozambique starting to cry in front of me about what was happening in Zimbabwe. This guy was one of the most powerful person in Mozambique at that time, completely unable to have one serious influence on the country. But at the same time, you had Mbeki trying to make, and your presentation was really nice. I think I totally support it. But I would like just to finish my comments, because I think your presentation were really good. for the 10th anniversary of the independence of Mozambique in 2004, President Chissano, in a very large public event, invited Mugabe, Mbeki, and himself to make presentations to thousands of people. Chissano started in many languages. He was able to speak, he still is able to speak many languages. And after that, Mbeki followed in English and some local languages. The last one, amazingly, was Mugabe. Mugabe didn't really speak any local languages in Mozambique, and no Portuguese. And he spoke for 30 minutes only in English. All the people were absolutely under the charisma of Mugabe. Mbeki and Chissano were looking his children. And that, for me, is the reason why, a large part, things didn't really change, because Mugabe is the figure, and they cannot go really against him.
Just a question, listening to Linda and Linda's presentations, and really appreciated both, thank you. Triangulating what you were presenting there, because I sort of find myself wondering what looks like failure, abject failure on the part of the Mbeki administration's attempts to bring Mugabe to some sort of heel, how that perhaps is shaped also by the interests of certainly mining capital in South Africa to get a foot in, because this is the period we're talking about, right? It overlaps quite neatly. I'm just throwing that out as a thought to you, whether in fact that adds a dimension of understanding potentially to what looks like near failure.
And one more from John for them?
Well, yes, John Saul from New York, formerly retired or something like that. But I just to remind ourselves that each of the states that were contested physically and militarily in Southern Africa that became liberated and are now key players in SADC are still, the liberation movement is still in power as the ruling party. And I think it's important, therefore, to probe a little bit on what Linda was saying, is why the ANC, but also other movements, feel inclined to support Mugabe. And she mentioned a loyalty factor, and there's also a historical precedent factor that they were all in this together, so-called. And there's also a sense that if the legitimacy of one is undermined, then that overriding national liberation legitimacy of all may be in question. And I think there's also another factor in addition to that last one, I think that's important. The other one is about Zimbabwe vis-a-vis South Africa. Why did South Africa, particularly under Mbeki, support, in effect, Mugabe and company? And I think one of the reasons is the MDC. The MDC emerges, and you didn't mention this, and I'd like to hear what you think about it. Emerges as a voice of labor. And I think that is incredibly threatening to each of these states, that somehow labor could have a political voice. And you can see that in South Africa. Mandela turned on Cosatu innumerable times for things they said and stepped out of line with things. In addition to that, Vavi took tremendous heat when he had a meeting with civil society on behalf of the unions without reference to the SACP or the ANC. Now in this Cosatu meeting, which is taking place today, we don't know exactly what's happening, but it seems pretty clear that to some degree the ANC has mobilized those members of Cosatu who are still trade union loyal to the ANC alliance to attack NUMSA, and possibly, if they can, drive it out of Cosatu. So I think that, although I'm quite aware that NUMSA, that the MDC has become a different movement now than it was when it first began, and who knows what it, maybe Richard or Linda can tell us what it has become. I'm not quite sure myself, but it certainly began as a voice of labor. And Mr. Tsvangirai got his legitimacy, and I think it did scare these other states, and not least South Africa, because they had a big trade union movement that was phenomenally inside the tripartite alliance, but had the capacity to go it alone. And I think we're beginning to see in the NUMSA activity, the biggest union in South Africa, don't forget, in the NUMSA activity, the real threat that this poses to the existent power, and also in the ability of Bave to make a link at one point at least to civil society, the threat to South Africa that exists there. So I think the labor component of this crisis has to be taken a bit more seriously perhaps. I mean, all the other forces you evoked so well in making sense of it.
Should we take a moment to get some responses?
The frustration of regional leaders, I mean, we've been told for years that they talked tough to Mugabe behind doors, and I know that Mandela was very clear that he didn't like meeting with Mugabe and so on and so on. And I loved Alistair Sparks' depiction of Mbeki as being kind of head boy to Mugabe's schoolmaster, because I think there was an element of that, and I think this point about Mugabe's role as a father figure comes into it. But, you know, yes, they were frustrated that he wouldn't play ball, but they basically just never wanted to deal. South Africa had all the instruments. I've studied what the apartheid regime did with Rhodesia. And I mean, in a heartbeat right at the start, they could have stopped it. And when you ask these guys, why didn't you, they just say, we would never do that. And even though, as I say, I know ANC and ZANU-PF loathed each other, they nevertheless reconstructed the relationship after 1980. And then kind of morphed it into something that it never was. And Mbeki ruined his own reputation and many aspects of South Africa's transformation by hanging on to it. So you explain it to me, I mean, I think it's completely perverse. And that's what I've been trying to analyze and sort out, because it is very contradictory. I mean, it kind of pushed a lot of the buttons in the region too. The West went in pretty hard and heavy in an undiplomatic way, not only in that silly letter from the British minister who,
Claire Short,
who said that they didn't want to, they didn't feel that the land issue was their responsibility anymore. But even more so in the early 2000s, when things really started to seriously change in Zimbabwe, Western diplomats apparently were very, very heavy-handed, and that just pressed buttons all over the region. And this kind of militant, we're not gonna bow to this at all. And then Mugabe plays his cards very, very superbly. I mean, of course, he charms everybody. But by now that charm should be wearing thin. I mean, it's a bit silly, but it's still there. Obviously, he's just been elected to these positions. And it boggles the mind from outside. But inside, it's a reality. That, as one of my students says, is the dynamic. You know, that's what we have to recognize.
And the trade union factor?
That was just my first answer.
Oh, sorry.
Failure of Mbeki shaped by mining capital, the contradictions here. I mean, it's really hard. I think behind that's a contradictory reality. On the one hand, I'm fascinated by Richard's research, but the treatment of capital from outside has been pretty hard hitting. I mean, farms were taken over. It didn't matter if they were South African or not. Indigenization was pushed really hard. So mining seems to be a bit of an exception. But in the early days, I mean, with a crashing economy, and with even, as you were telling us, that Zimplats was kind of put on hold for a while, South Africa was not Zimbabwe was not a great place to do business. It was ranked as one of the world's worst. So its attraction for South African capital has that kind of contradictory flavor. Yes, the resources are mega, but two, you've got a situation which is incredibly insecure. And certainly since Mugabe's re-election, direct foreign investment came to a screeching halt. And I think that's reality. MDC's emergence as a voice of labor, that I think was true at the beginning, but I think that it's become a lot less so in the period since. You know, Gibson Sibanda was Tsvangirai's #2, and then when the split in the MDC happened, that took away some of the labor voice. But also, the thing we need to remember about Zimbabwe's labor movement is that it shrunk I mean, the country's become deindustrialized, so the formal labor force is much, much smaller. And with Chiang Kai-shek's adoption of a neoliberal project, the relations aren't quite the same, so that I think his positioning as a voice of labor is much less so now than it was then. And in terms of South Africa's reaction to the MDC, you're quite right. Vavi Kasatu, the SACB, they were all much better than the ANC on this issue. They did visit, they did get thrown out. Vavi and a Kasatu delegation visited them and got thrown out. And I think that the ANC may have been whistling in the wind, but their initial response was to say that, you know, they were really dismissive. They said, well, look at Chiluba, how can trade unions run a government? They just never took the MDC seriously. And through that whole period, and I mean, if you read Chiang Kai-shek's book, the examples of the ANC treatment of him in the Mbeki period were really quite something. I mean, Mbeki really did earn lasting enmity, I would say.
And if the MDC had been allowed to win the first or second time that it did win, from all reports,
yeah.
it might have been a very different picture.
Yeah, I mean, there's nothing like power to change everybody's minds. You know, whoever, I mean, look at right now. Mugabe engineering the victory in 2013, and the whole world smiles on him. The EU, I mean, Zimbabwe's coming out of the cold. The EU is now, you know, heading to Harare.
So why wouldn't they allow MDC to win?
Well,
help
because
it, help
they didn't take them seriously. They didn't want them. They were. They
It's
were.
more than that. I think it's more than that.
Okay, you fill in the blanks.
Yeah, I mean, and I pick up your point from the beginning that the MDC was a program before it was a party. And the process started in 1997-98 after those series of strikes, the largest strikes in 50 years in Zimbabwe, which were across the board and brought out more than 1 million people in December, when was it, December 2007, in 1997. In February of, I think it was 1999, the year the MDC was formed, the trade unions and the National Constitutional Assembly convened the National Working People's Agenda for Change, which I was there and I was part of that time. It was basically all of the larger community-based organizations which had some stake in social and economic rights, and they basically drew out a program for social democratic development state. And the idea was that you would go and put that to ZANU, which was in crisis, a political crisis, give them some opportunity to regain credit, and if they didn't, you would form a party. And that's how the MDC came into effect. So that was in February, the MDC was formed in July, August.
September.
Well, officially, that was the launch rally. But it was approved by the General Council of the ZCTU in July or August, anyway. So it was very much shepherded by the ZCTU and Chiang Kai and Gibson. But there were many others who were working on social and economic rights in Zimbabwe at the time who were very central. The people from TARS, the Training and Research Support Center, and Community Working Group on Health, women's coalitions, and of course the National Constitutional Assembly. And it really did have that feeling of a united democratic movement. That was the center of gravity of the party when it was formed. The way I explain it, from having been a member of the MDC at the time, was that as soon as those elections took place, and they were crooked elections, it was impossible to skew the vote in the urban areas. That was very clear that they had won. In the rural areas, you skew the vote just by not giving people access.
Yeah.
So they chased out people who were election observers. They chased out counters, and they never produced final statistics from those areas. And well, lo and behold, you have a huge win. That led to something unexpected, and it was the fact that many of those people standing in urban ridings did not represent the mass base of the MDC. They were urban professionals and lawyers, academics, people who've been involved in the National Constitutional Assembly, human rights activists, but at a management level, Mike Oretz of the world and others, were very well intentioned but had no strong engagement inside of membership-based organization where there's a lot of accountability. The ZCTU executives, there were I think 6 different Secretary Generals of affiliated trade unions standing for MP. I think only one of them got elected because they were standing in more difficult areas. And immediately the the tone of the party changed because there was separation between the parliamentary caucus, which took on the responsibility of policy making, and everybody else. And by the way, Morgan Tsvangirai wasn't in Parliament, and it was a very easy way to isolate and marginalize him from the get-go. The Secretary General, Welshman Mube, the leader of the split faction some years later, was in Parliament and used that position very effectively. Obviously, you know, we cited the NDCR. But there are technical and historical reasons why these things happen. And then, of course, business and white capital and donors. The donors flooded the MDC and the caucus with training sessions, information sessions, visits to Washington, so on and so forth. And then you see the tone of the party shifting. You don't see the tone of the constituency of the party shifting. You would go to any labor forum or a social meeting organized, you know, informally by the MDC in those years, and the demands are still the same from them. So the voters hadn't shifted, but I think the caucus had, including Tsvangirai. And Tsvangirai's been all over the place. It's been a problem. So the MDC is in a different place. But yes, to get back to the key point, I had very much had the sense at that time, because I went with Tsvangirai in his first forays into South Africa to, you know, be introduced. I had very much the feeling that the South Africans saw this as the future and they didn't want it.
I think that's right.
They really didn't want it, because in those years Morgan was very articulate. He spoke like a South African trade unionist. He used terms like hegemony better or more accurately than many of my graduate students. And maybe I should work on that. And he was inspiring, and that was frightening. That was frightening. Oh, and it was just what I wanted to address the question from Harlan. Yeah. And the question about Mugabe. You know, I've always thought of, you know, this is not just being about Mugabe. He's very skillful, a tactician. He has a lot of reverential baggage, if you want, with him. But Mugabe, and more so ZANU-PF, for me, is a way of life. It's a mode of accumulation. And it's a very sophisticated, surviving, sustainable mode of accumulation in some ways. And I think the ANC, and let's say not the ANC, the political elite in South Africa recognize that for what it is. They recognize it. They engage with it. I mean, this is part of my presentation is about this. They're part of it. They get drawn in. And, you know, part of the story around platinum in the 2000s, and platinum it pays less than half of what the entire gold sector makes in taxes, although it makes a fortune. The figures are astounding. They have a free ride in Zimbabwe until ZANU needs political help from time to time. At the time of the 2008 elections, when the South Africans were starting to dither and say, who did they go after? Zimplats. We need to reopen this black empowerment credits that you have because it's not fair, and we need to take 51% of this, and maybe we'll give it to the Chinese or maybe we'll give it to the Russians. Every time it comes to a political crisis, they get you in the pocketbook. And MZ Kamalo is the same thing. But Zimplats is the most high profile because it represents such value to Implats, and Implats, of course, is close to circles of power. Zimplats would make a fantastic PhD. I would be happy to read it.
I haven't asked the question yet.
Okay. There were a couple hands before you, though. So what I'd like to do is maybe ask that everyone keep their questions really short. And Blair, should we have two more rounds of questions?
Yeah, I think another 10 minutes or so.
Another 10 minutes?
Yeah.
Okay. And remember to introduce yourself before your very short, concise question.
I'm Toby Morsum, and I am a contract instructor here in Institute of African Studies. I am wondering how you would integrate an analysis of the energy minerals complex. I mean, David MacDonald uses the term recolonization when he talks about electric capitalism, recolonization on the power grid. And it seems to me like your analysis, both the presentations were excellent, by the way, but the analysis of all of the South African capital that is penetrating the region is so heavily dependent upon Eskom, upon energy transmission. I mean, white goods, if you look at an agricultural sector, it's piggeries, it's chicken coops and all mechanized sort of processes, also as well as dairy. It requires refrigeration, and I'm wondering what the politics around that are in Zimbabwe. But for me, I know it's Dan sort of suggested these underlying assumptions, underlying material conditions are not determining. But it's really hard to not think that Hein is right in his book in saying that, you know, fundamentally the South African state is stuck on this 100-year-old complex.
Okay, there was in the back.
Hi, Katie North. I'm an undergrad student at Carleton. And I just had a question geared towards the conflict diamonds we were discussing in Zimbabwe. And I believe you mentioned that they currently make up 25% of the global market?
Of stones, not of value, but of stones.
Okay.
Yeah.
And yet it's largely artisanal mining that's happening?
It's mechanized artisanal mining now, yeah. But they also have kimberlite pipes, but most
Right.
of it is from artisanal fields.
I was wondering if you could further explain the relationship that the Kimberley process has had on the artisanal mining?
I'm sorry, hearing some, having trouble
Yeah.
hearing you.
I was wondering if you could further explain the relationship that the Kimberley certification process has had on the artisanal mining industry, if that's been somewhat positive, the relationship, what impact that's had. Thanks.
And there was a gentleman, yes.
Hi, I'm Aubrey Morantz, and I'm with the Africa Study Group, which tries to prevent African issues from sliding off the table with respect to Canadian government policy. My question is really maybe a comment addressed to Linda, and that is whether you followed the career of Mbeki since he's become, subsequent to being president, the chief mediator for the African Union High-Level Implementation Panel, the AUHIP, in Sudan. My impression is that in that role, although he's obviously intended to be a neutral personality, he's usually managed to bias his decisions in favor of the ANC government of Sudan, both with respect to Darfur and with respect to southern Sudan and southern Kordofan and Blue Nile. So I don't know whether that is consistent or not with his support for Mugabe, but my impression is that there seems to be some continuity there.
So you answer these and then we'll take the remaining questions.
Okay, I haven't followed Mbeki very closely in the Sudan, but I was fascinated with the way he got drummed out of the negotiations in the Côte d'Ivoire, with France really saying, go away little boy and learn something before you come back. I mean, you really don't understand, was their approach, which I thought must have kind of been pretty hard to listen to for Mbeki. I mean, I'm always been mused. I think he works incredibly hard. I don't think he's been very successful in what I've seen, but I honestly can't answer that. Somebody else might know more about what he's done in Sudan. He does pop up on Zimbabwe very regularly. Not only did he attend the inauguration last August, but he's recently been known to make, he read Ian Schoon's book on land reform and has been quite triumphant. We weren't sure about Zimbabwean land reform, but now we know it's absolutely right, so I assume that's all he's read. But he's certainly still very much in the debate. Conflict diamonds and the Kimberley process effect, I think that basically Zimbabwe fought the Kimberley process tooth and nail and has been central in its demolition. And I'll leave the MEC complex to you, Richard.
I can't say much about the MC complex except if you look at the interest of ESCOM and DBSA in places like DRC and big hydro development and the gas fields of Mozambique and Tanzania, which are really big issues, then you can see that there's a rolling out, and it's certainly they see their future offshore, literally, and in the region. There's not much more that I can add substantively to that because I don't work in that sector anymore. Around diamonds, Kimberley process represents a defeat for the civil society coalition and a defeat for the broader credibility of the Kimberley process. It's once Zimbabwe effectively overturned the ban, and the ban was for human rights abuses. More than 250 people were shot from helicopter gunships and killed by dogs. I've seen the evidence of that. It's there. Everybody's seen the evidence. It was widely debated in Kimberley, and South Africa was running a rear guard and helping the Pofu, the ex-Minister of Mines, to overturn the ban. And it was quite horrible, the debates in Kimberley, because the ban was what constituted a human rights abuse. And you might know that under the Kimberley process, which was set up to really stop the wars in Angola and Sierra Leone, the definition of a conflict diamond was a diamond that fueled a standing rebel army against a legitimate government. And so I've written elsewhere that Zimbabwe is actually the modern face of conflict diamonds, because we don't see those kinds of cases anymore. We see governments and military and security apparatuses belonging to them actually engaged in the human rights abuses, which is what's happened in Zimbabwe. It was the Zimbabwe Army and the Zimbabwe Republic Police that killed people, moved them off the land, and then turned them into artisanal miners at the point of a gun. So in some ways, Zimbabwe was a litmus test for the KP, that you need to update what the KP's charter says about what constitutes a rights abuse. That it's not about rebels, it's about people being injured, and lack of transparency of the more than $2 billion that clearly has been made. We can tell it by the records of sales of Zimbabwean stone. There's only been about 400 million that's come and been reported into Treasury as a pittance compared to what was actually owed to the Zimbabwe government, especially because the Zimbabwe government is a joint venture partner on all the miners. There's been no profit remittance to speak of from this enormous resource in a country which is desperate for foreign currency and for secondary mining beneficiation. So as a result, in Kimberley, we've seen the departure of some of the founding members of Kimberley. So Canada's own Ian Smiley, who drafted the peer review mechanism for the Kimberley Charter, resigned over Zimbabwe. Global Witness, which was a founding member from civil society, resigned over the overturning of the ban. Even in the diamond sector, Martin Rappaport, one of the founding members of Kimberley, left in disgust, and all said the same thing: we will not whitewash an unfair, illegal, and bloody trade anymore. We want nothing to do with it. It doesn't mean that nothing will happen. People are looking at Kimberley Plus now, using Kimberley rules, but also updating them in the context of what constitutes a human rights abuse around a diamond. And I think that's where a lot of energy will go in the future. I mean, it is a bit ironic that those who had been part of Kimberley at the beginning and were nominated in 2003 for a Nobel Peace Prize are the ones who ended up leaving it 10 years later.
Okay, there's 4 questions, so let's do that quickly so that we all can have a chance to.
Okay, I'm Joe Holmes. I'm an alumnus from Carleton University. I've had a lifelong interest in South Africa. I took a master's course back in the 80s with Douglas England, quite a while ago. Anyway, my question is to do with Zimbabwe and the farms that have been taken over by the whites. Like, what impact has that had on their agriculture? I know it's negative, but the people put out of work, and are they importing food, or what are they doing as far as the food and that?
And then in the very back.
Thank you. My name is Tamara Ndaba. I'm from South Africa. I would like to know what is the role of colonialism and apartheid in the South African situation in this discussion that we're having now. I've noticed that number of speakers, I think the speaker on this side has touched on it, and the speaker over here, going back. Because number of speakers are actually looking at South Africa post-1994. And for me, because I'm hoping for a situation where at the end of this conference we'll have something that says what could be done then to take the process forward. And for me, you cannot look at the South African question and actually the African, even Zimbabwe, Zimbabwe that we are referring to now, without looking at the impact that colonialism did we cannot look at the South African and these two African countries that we are currently discussing without locating the role of imperial this colonialism and apartheid. So let's look, when we look at the South African, let's look at it holistically. It cannot be the ANC government. I do agree that there are challenges, and of course there are good things that happened in South Africa. But I want the speakers to tell me what is the role, such that when moving forward, looking at ways of dealing, what are the challenges, we locate it properly. And because it's important for us to know why are we here. It's definitely not the past 20 years in South Africa. We are here because of everything that happened in that country. But again, I'm having a question, when does it become right, these principles of democracy, fair elections, and then people vote, for instance, in South Africa and say, this particular party gets 72%. When does it become accepted that the people of South Africa have spoken and given mandate? And I hear from other quarters, people, they say they were coerced. Repeatedly, people of South Africa have spoken despite the challenges. And when does it become accepted then that these are the democracies and the principles are being adhered to? And when does it become sovereignty? And when do states having this right to do these things in self-determination, when does it become acceptable with the certain countries and with other countries? Thank you.
Mark from Queens. Linda, I wonder if you've heard on either side of the border any allusions to the ethnic question, you know, that the affinity between Ndebele and the Zulu, is that hinted at anywhere as a means of pressurizing or some romantic?
The affinity of the Ndebele with Zulu.
Yes.
Okay, and then two more questions before we wrap up.
Is that me?
Yes.
I'm David Moore. In 1974, I was here studying for a Bachelor in Journalism. 1 year here. So don't blame Carlton on this question. But I'd like to bring the two panels together, which were fantastic panels, excellent panels. So Dan, 2014 Strategy and Tactics. Fine. Incredibly widespread informalization of the economy. Informal workers all over the place, from artisans, no workers in Zimbabwe anymore. Combining the financialization, services, and so on. What do progressive forces or trade unionists or progressive politicians, thinkers, do think about, what should they think about this mass force of unemployed people? Thabo Mbeki, in that 2001 paper that he wrote about Zambia, real criticism, and of course the biggest insult you can do as a Marxist is to say that a political party relies on the lumpen proletariat, which is what he said ZANU-PF had ended up relying on in terms of war base. So you got lumpen proletariat, a lot of them. What do you do? Strategy and tactics 2014.
And then our last question.
Yeah, I'm going to reply to that. Far be it for me to be an apologist for Thabo Mbeki, but I think apart from whether or where there was not terror of the labor movement, there are other considerations at play in the ANC political culture about how to deal with Zimbabwe. One is the fact that going back to 1910, Zimbabwe, what it was previously, has always been a stone in the shoe of the South African state, whether it was around UDI and petrol for Rhodesia as it was then, and you won't go into that. But must never be forgotten that the Mbeki leadership of the ANC was a generation of people who had lived through really horrendous ideological civil wars in Mozambique and in Angola. And then with the 1990s were confronted with Rwanda, Sierra Leone, Liberia. And there was a real, and I think genuine concern that Zimbabwe might implode. And particularly the question, what if, quote, the MDC were allowed to win, would the largely ZANU army accept this? And I think that for a movement that had come to power and had managed to avoid what we all thought was a very likely scenario, a terrible racial civil war, the question of social stability, the absence of an explosion, is a consideration. I'm not in any way saying that this was the right policy, but it's far too simplistic to say they were just scared of the MDC because they thought that this might encourage Cosatu at home.
wanted to say I don't think you were saying that.
No,
It was,
you-
it was one of the factors. I agree with you.
Yeah.
With complete, on your point about stability. On the issue of looking at colonialism, you know, one of the interesting things I think about the MDC, when it first started laying out its principles in Zimbabwe, I won't talk about South Africa on this, but in the MDC was to reclaim the mantle of the liberation struggle. To say that it wasn't just a party which fought that struggle, it was our parents, us, and our families and our communities. And we fought that with expectations. The expectations have now been turned against us under neoliberalism. And we reclaimed that mantle. And there was a lovely line about, you know, there comes a time in the history of every country when the people have to reassert the identity of the nation and their rights under their constitution. And that's what the MDC initially had stood for, with quite a progressive agenda. Nobody who was reasonable in Zimbabwe at that time doubted the echoing legacy of colonialism in Zimbabwe 20 years after. Nobody. In fact, the question was, what do we do about it? How do we transform that state? The MDC itself had a lot of position papers about how do you take a state which ZANU had inherited and in many ways didn't change that much. How do you retool it for a new kind of program, an economic and social development program, which is more in keeping with the principles of liberation struggle. So I think this has been at the center of debate in Zimbabwe for some time. The problem with the militarization of politics in Zimbabwe is that all issues of the national question become condensed down into an issue of a figure or a party, and of a history which most of the population doesn't have access to because they weren't born during that period. So authenticity gets linked to something which is beyond the reach of most people, and it's enforced by violence, legal and extra-legal violence, and in all the shenanigans that we've seen in Zimbabwe in the 2000s. Around the question of agriculture, well, it's had a huge impact. There's a big literature on this. And there's the other position that it's recreated the agricultural economy into a self-sustaining one, a productive small-scale economy. But when you look at the linkages of Zimbabwe's commercial agriculture, and it's gone, it's not coming back, into industry, it was a huge supplier of inputs into that industry, and was one of the main reasons why light industry in Zimbabwe is also gone.
Yeah, I'll just pick up then on the agricultural question because it links with Hein's point. People who argue that Zimbabwean agriculture, based on this structural transformation from large units to small-scale ones, have a very hopeful future. And they look at two sectors, the tobacco and maize sectors. But I mean, Richard's point is absolutely central. What it may have done has, it's unlikely that they'll be able to compete with large farms in the region, let alone globally. And even if they can make some inroads, the studies right now are contested and small. And I agree entirely that the development trajectory that it may put Zimbabwe on is, small-scale agriculture, not much industry and mining. That they've taken out one huge sector. Now it's made the sector more broad-based, but the overall figures are pretty traumatic still in terms of overall production in the economy. The economy has now dropped 40% from what it was in 2000. So these are I see them as green shoots. Whether they'll be able to survive is questionable. And if John Sanders questioning this in South Africa, it's I think even more the case in Zimbabwe.
I wonder if these war vets have actually done anything with the farms.
Well, it's not, some people who've been on the farms, 230,000 families. And there's no question that the productive base of the economy is bigger. But whether it's going to amount to anything is still very much a work in progress. I mean, tobacco sector's impressive, maize is also improving, but it remains to be seen in the regional context or in the national development context of Zimbabwe. But, yeah, no, I do. I just wanted Barbara once in.
Yes, thank you, Professor Freeman. I just wanted to say, just to answer your question, sir, that they have done something. Some people who have been given land have done something with the land in Zimbabwe. Yes, there have been challenges, and the commercial farming has not performed as well as it could have. But we could also start talking about why they haven't. The white farmers who had the land before had all these loans at their disposal from the banks, which has not been the case with the new people who have got land after the land reform exercise. So we could, get into why they haven't done. But to answer your question, yes, they have.
Some small scale.
Absolutely. The small scale farmers have actually, right now, tobacco production from small scale farmers is actually much higher than it used to be.
In certain areas, but not overall in the production figures. So the hope is there, but not yet the reality. There are good signs as well as bad.
And I think if sanctions against Zimbabwe were to be removed,
Okay,
I think
we're
we
drifting.
could get, but let's, okay. Over to you, Professor, thank you.
The issue of colonization raised at the back. I mean, I think that the point of my entire presentation was to say that this attachment to a memory, even if it's a reconstructed memory and a totally changed memory, is what's driven a lot of the failed politics of South Africa and Zimbabwe. I think that it will only change when that generation has gone. Having spent most of my personal and professional life supporting national liberation movements and seeing what they've become in power, I now think that it takes one set of talents to run a struggle and another to run a country. And I think that it is that anti-colonialism, anti-imperialism resurrected, which is a real source of many of the region's problems. The affinity of the Ndebele and the Zulu. I think that Moletsi Mbeki has written about this and the importance of going back to the 19th century, not just to understand the origins of the difficulties today, not just in the arrival of the whites and the pioneer column and all of that and roads, etc., but to go back before that to the arrival of these kind of offshoots from the Mfecane and then their hostile interaction with the existing population in the eastern part of the country and the resentment of the way in which those Zulu immigrants behaved, which Moletsi Mbeki argues explains some of the politics today. It's not that long ago. I love the phrase, and I'm going to use it, a stone in the shoe for South Africa, Zimbabwe. Mbeki makes a point, and I quite agree with him, that the West did nothing on Rwanda. It didn't do, it doesn't do anything today on Central African Republic. It was lousy on Darfur, Liberia, you name it. There are all kinds of examples. And it really paid an unreasonable amount of attention to the handful of white farmers who were killed. It's just so out of proportion. I mean, the Eastern DRC, 5 million people displaced. God knows how many died. There's no way to know. And yet the focus on Zimbabwe was ferocious. And so he just dismisses all of Western input as based on racism. And Alistair Sparks makes that point in his books from interviews with him. He just sees this in that way. And I think, too, your point is right on the genuine concern within South Africa about stability. They just dismissed the MDC, whether it was because they were frightened of the labor factor in South African politics or not. I mean, I'm as willing to believe that as I'm not. But the contempt with which those leaders talked about and dealt with the MDC didn't change, ironically, until Jacob Zuma came to power, and he was more willing to give them the benefit of the doubt. And some of the reason, I have to say, which is a bit rude of me, was because Tsvangirai appeared in South Africa with whites in his entourage. And the ANC looked at that and said, what have we got here? And they just didn't think the MDC could run the country. I mean, everybody I've talked to in positions of power in South Africa, it was not, but it was also because their brothers were ZANU-PF. That was an absolute non-negotiable. Even if they hadn't
very new brothers, Linda, they were at war with each other.
I know. Well, that's why I say it's such a paradox that they flipped like this, and they might be stronger pro-ZANU-PF because of the flip. It's bizarre, but they all sing the same song sheet. I mean, we sat and listened to Sidney Keith Muddy for 3 hours make this case. How he'd grown up on the borders of Zimbabwe and listening to ZANU-PF on the radio. I mean, it boggles the mind, but that nevertheless is the way it is.
Okay, thank you.
Great. Thanks everyone for your patience. We had two great panelists. We'll have an hour for lunch. Probably maybe break in about 55 minutes if Nduka wants to recite some poetry. Please help yourself to food. I just want to make a quick note that, as many of you know, but perhaps not all, we have a listserv that sends out information once a week about upcoming public events on Africa and the African diasporas in the Ottawa-Gatineau area. Occasionally we'll deign to put something in Toronto or Montreal as well. There's things happen there. If you're interested to be on it, please put your email address on it. It's information about public events, talks, conferences, films, fundraisers, calls for papers, etc. Thanks very much.